Love does not commit suicide. You have to kill it. As already mentioned, we're going to be talking about some relationship behaviors that are fairly common, but are also strong indicators of a future divorce. So with no further ado, let's get started. The first one is called harsh startups to a discussion. This is when one partner uses criticism or sarcasm to begin a confrontation. Usually the aggressor uses language that is accusatory, blaming, and derogatory, such as, "Why do you always have to be so selfish? The problem with you is that you never," or "The trouble with you is." One of the problems with harsh startups is that it initiates the flight or fight syndrome in the other spouse. So, if the spouse decides to take flight, then the issue never gets resolved. And on the other hand, if the spouse decides to stay and fight, then an argument usually escalates into an unhealthy shouting match. Harsh startups always do more harm than good. They are a key indicator of predicting a future divorce because 1, nothing ever gets resolved, and 2, all they do is contribute to building resentment between the husband and wife. Later, in the module on communication, we'll talk about a better, gentler, and kinder way to bring up issues with one another. Okay, the second predictor of a future divorce is criticism. Criticism is defined as attacking your partner with blaming and fault-finding statements with the intention of showing them how wrong they are. And like with harsh startups, the attacker uses accusatory and exaggerated language in their approach like, "You always," or "You never," or "When will you ever?" The only thing criticism will accomplish is it'll put your spouse on the defensive and hinders any opportunity for a healthy conversation. Fortunately, there's a better way. A smarter approach is to convert the criticism into a complaint. And to do that, all you have to do is simply reverse the personal pronouns so that instead of using the accusatory word you use the word I. Then, just follow that I statement up with a description of how you feel. For example, instead of saying, "You always leave the gas tank on empty," it can be converted into a complaint by saying, "I get upset when the gas tank is left on empty." Or, instead of saying, "You never give me any privacy when I'm studying," it's better to say, "I feel frustrated when I'm interrupted while studying." When done correctly, a complaint sounds a lot more like feedback to your partner than a personal attack. It's a way of educating your spouse about how you feel about something rather than blaming them for it. It comes across to them completely different. And before we move on, there's one more lesson we can learn from harsh startups and criticism, and it's this: how you start a conversation will pretty much determine how it's going to end. When you start badly, it's going to end badly. But on the other hand, when you start with a softer and gentler language, like with a complaint, then you're much more likely to have a constructive conversation. Okay, let's move on to our third divorce predictor. It's stonewalling. This is when a spouse deliberately leaves a conflict, either physically, emotionally, or verbally. And don't shoot the messenger on this, but here's an interesting factoid. Wives do 6 times more of the fussing, while husbands make up 85% of the stonewallers. It seems more natural for us men to be stonewallers because we don't normally communicate as easily and as freely as women. If we start to feel attacked or overwhelmed, it's easier for us to just walk away and to retreat. Unfortunately, stonewalling doesn't usually work very well. When a husband stonewalls, the wife is only likely to get more upset, more frustrated, and more determined. Then she's tempted to become louder and more aggressive in making her point. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you that when one spouse is getting more intense and determined, and the other is trying to escape, that it's not going to end very well. So to you as a future husband, let me say this. For most wives, communication with her husband is so important that for you to walk away from a discussion is much like an insult to them. Your wife would tend to take that very personally. In fact, you may want to check this out with your fiancé, but most women would rather have you openly disagree with them than to completely retreat from the conversation. So, if I can give you one tidbit of advice, it would be to commit yourself to being more engaging with your wife, especially when it's during an argument. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Top Gun, I want to remind you of a scene that takes place near the end of the movie. The American aircraft is being threatened by a bunch of Russian MiGs. One pilot, Iceman, is already up in the sky trying to fight them off, and Maverick, who was played by Tom Cruise, is supposed to come to the rescue, but he has a dangerous moment of stonewalling and even turns his aircraft around. Everybody's yelling to him over the radio, "Get in the fight, engage Maverick, engage." He finally comes to his senses, turns the aircraft around, engages in the fight, shoots down a couple of Russian MiGs, basically rescues the other pilot, Iceman, and saves the aircraft carrier. So think of it this way. You and your wife are each other's wingman. You need to be there for each other. You need to work together and attack the problems head on in order to beat them. Okay, I've spoken to the future husbands, so now let me speak to his future wife. My only suggestion to you is to be very mindful of your body language when you're speaking to him. You see, 80% of all communication is body language and voice tones. So if you're already upset, it's very easy for you to come across as threatening and aggressive, even if you use the right words. You know, it's a big difference between saying, "I get upset when the gas tank is left on empty," and "I get upset when the gas tank is left on empty." It's important to use softer vocal tones and body language because, as we already mentioned, it's natural for men to stonewall when they feel threatened or overwhelmed. But there's also a deeper reason behind it. One of the husband's primary needs from his wife is to be respected. In fact, some surveys indicate that a man would prefer to be respected more than to be loved. So when a wife criticizes her husband, it comes across as demeaning and emasculating. It's the opposite of respect. So the bottom line is this. With women doing 6 times the criticism, and with men being the stonewallers 85% of the time, there's plenty of room for improvement from both sexes. Men need to be intentional about being more engaging with their wife, and the wife needs to practice good diplomacy in expressing her concerns. Make sense? Okay, let's move on. The 4th predictor of a future divorce is contempt. Contempt is any behavior that makes your spouse feel put down, devalued, or unworthy. This can include, but not limited to, calling them names, mocking them, demeaning their ideas, or rolling your eyes when they're talking to you. Contempt is an indication that the aggressor had been hurt in the past, and it's been festering inside of them until it finally comes out in the way they treat their spouse. Contempt is a poison. It warps your perception about your spouse. It will make you feel like he or she can't do anything right. And contempt is the worst of all divorce predictors because it's often the source of harsh startups and criticism. And one of the best ways to protect yourself from contempt is by monitoring your own attitude and mindset. Your own self-awareness is important because you need to nip it in the bud and stop it before it even takes root. The Bible verse Proverbs 4:23 comes to mind. Above all things, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. You see, there will be times when your spouse will disappoint you, or hurt you, or upset you, but you can't let the frustration and anger fester inside. You have to be able to let it go. In fact, what we're really talking about here is forgiveness. And forgiveness is one of the most important attributes that you can find in a spouse. Unfortunately, it's too often underrated. I saw one survey of the top 10 qualities that men and women were looking for in a partner, and forgiveness wasn't even mentioned. Obviously, these people had never been in a relationship before because it doesn't take long before you realize how important forgiveness is. A marriage can't survive if the partners can't forgive each other. Without forgiveness, contempt would take root and destroy the relationship. So let's try to get some clarity on forgiveness. Some people believe that forgiveness is the automatic feeling of restoration and reconciliation between two people. Sometimes it happens that way, But more often than not, you have to first decide to forgive, and then afterwards, you'll probably have to remind yourself very often that you decided to let it go. The feeling of restoration and forgiveness comes later. Forgiveness is first and foremost a decision before it's a feeling. Now, there's one secret that makes forgiveness a lot easier, and that is to develop a culture of appreciation. We'll talk more about this in a later module, but to develop a culture of appreciation, all you have to do is keep a mental list of your spouse's positive attributes. A culture of appreciation is the antithesis of contempt, and the psychology is simple. The more you focus on your spouse's good qualities, the less glaring the bad qualities become. And it works. Relationship scientists have discovered that the happiest couples are the ones who intentionally look for the good qualities in the spouse and focus on them. A culture of appreciation changes everything. It changes the way you see your spouse, and it changes the way you treat them. You will find that it makes your spouse easier to love and easier to forgive. So to fight contempt, you need to develop a culture of appreciation and forgiveness. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, let's move on to our next predictor of a future divorce. It's called defensiveness. A defensive spouse is defined as one who denies the partner's statements, refuses to admit the role and problems, or avoids any responsibility for the impact they may have on the partner. You see, they don't want to listen to anybody about what they may have to improve on because it's too threatening to them. The problem with being defensive is it's a major roadblock to successful conflict resolution. One of the prerequisites for healthy conflict resolution is being able to make ourselves available to our spouse so that they can talk to us about something that's bothering them. We need to make ourselves open to them, and a person who is defensive can't do that. You see, when you can't talk about your problems, they don't go away, they just accumulate. They will only get bigger and eventually undermine your connection and intimacy. Part of emotional maturity is being able to put your defensive feelings aside so that your spouse can share their concerns. Okay, let's move on to our sixth and final divorce predictor. It's called failed repair attempts. Repair attempts are the use of words, phrases, and physical responses in an effort to de-escalate the tension during an argument. For instance, if a wife reaches out to her husband's hand, but he rejects her and refuses to hold her hand, then it's a failed repair attempt. If a husband and wife go to bed angry and they're not talking to each other, but one eventually rolls over and tries to cuddle or make up, but the other spouse gives them a cold shoulder, then that's a failed repair attempt. Or if one of you tries to offer some comic relief while the other fails to laugh and instead continues to argue the point, then that's a failed repair attempt. What Dr. Gottman discovered is that couples whose relationships eventually dissolved are the same couples whose repair attempts were rejected or they were never made in the first place. So it makes sense that being able to make and respond to repair attempts is an important skill to acquire. Here are some proven phrases that signal a repair attempt. I'm sorry. Let's call a timeout. We're getting off the topic. I love you. I understand how you feel. Okay, maybe you're right. Failed repair attempts have proven to be a strong indicator for a future divorce because they're also a strong indicator of the quality of the relationship. Couples that have a higher level of anger, resentment, and frustration are the same couples that are most likely to have failed repair attempts, while couples who score better in regards to friendship, respect, and appreciation for each other do a lot better in accepting each other's repair attempts. So the real secret to all of this is the quality and nature of relationship when you're not fighting. If you can maintain an underlying culture of appreciation and goodwill toward one another, then it's more likely your arguments will also end constructively and with more emotional closure. When you strengthen the friendship between the two of you, you also strengthen the heart of your marriage, and failed repair attempts are less likely. As you look at this list of divorce predictors, it's not uncommon to have some of these behaviors at some degree or another. The real danger arises when the intensity and frequency is too elevated. Fortunately, now that you're aware of them, it will help you avoid them. because when you know better, you can do better. This module is probably a little shorter than all the rest, but I felt it necessary to have a dedicated discussion on these behaviors and their dangers. So as you move to your homework assignment, I encourage you to find a more casual and fun environment for your discussion. Congratulations on the steps that you have taken to give your marriage the best possible start. We look forward to seeing you again in the next module.